In January of 1989, production would come to a close on Nirvana's first album, Bleach, costing them a total of $606.17. Now, in today's money, that would be around $1,500, but when all is said and done, that is still an incredibly affordable price even today. And Bleach would go on to define what it means for a band to sound grunge. So where Nevermind kind of went in more of a pop direction with Smells Like Teen Spirit, Come As You Are, you guys all know the songs. Songs like School and Floyd the Barber really show just what grunge sounded like without appealing to a more pop audience. So let's figure out how a band recorded a platinum record and did so for the price of an old Buick, because they weren't big yet. They were working with a budget that was a lot like yours or mine. So we'll break down the production techniques and then also the exact gear they used to do it.
Guardian Angel pointed us in the direction of Reciprocal Studios and Jack and Dino, who knows Jonathan Poneman, and Jack and Dino turned Jonathan Poneman on to our tape, and he thought it was really groovy, and he gave us a call, and we made a single, and then we made a record, and now we're here today.
So starting in January of 1988, production would begin on the album. Well, sort of begin on the album, and I'll explain what that means in one second. But these were all done at Reciprocal Recording Studios in Seattle with Jack and Dino. So he was the producer on Bleach, and he's also done like Soundgarden and Mudhoney and a bunch of other really cool Seattle bands. Pretty entrenched in that whole scene at the time. Now, the reason I said sort of earlier is because the album was really recorded in 3 different sessions. From the first session, there was Floyd the Barber, and then also Paper Cuts. They also recorded Downer at that session. Now, these were actually all tracked by Dale Crover of the Melvins. Jack even said that the kit was nicer, the hardware was nicer, it was tuned better. Crover was also just a really good drummer. So they weren't able to match the quality of those recordings with the new drummer, Chad Channing, who was the 5th drummer, by the way, number 5. And as we all know, he is not the last one. So supposedly there was a little bit of turmoil when it came to recording the drums, and specifically with the quality of the kit and the drum heads. So here, you can take a listen to a clip of Chad talking about it himself.
The heads we had tuned like really, really low to where like, I mean, it was like they were just barely on, it seemed. And it was kind of a real pain because, you know, with no flexibility in the heads, I couldn't get any snapback. And of course, with that, you know, it was basically like playing a bunch of cardboard boxes. I was actually amazed the drums came out as good as they did in the end result.
This is the mix that's gonna make or break my next video. Watch this. You can see here, it's a version of Garden Song, because the next Forensic Productions, which is a series on this channel, is going to be about recreating the Phoebe Bridgers tone. But here, in this software, you can see that we actually can measure a loudness penalty of this song. If you're uploading it to Spotify, it will match the loudness that Spotify usually will crush your songs to. This is incredibly useful. This is the file sharing software for musicians and audio engineers. And that's not just me saying that, that's audio engineers for Taylor Swift, for Mac DeMarco, and like Doja Cat. They are all already using today's sponsor, Samply. And that's because they have a bunch of tools specifically for sharing music. Like for example, if you upload your mix to Samply, and let's say you have a few other versions in the project as well, it will automatically chronologically sort your mixes. You can then A/B it in real time with lossless audio and that loudness penalty I've already discussed. You can even track payment information with the implemented Stripe payment plan. There's actually built-in file storage inside of Samply. And when you want to share your music, you want to share your project, it shows up like it's an album inside of like Spotify or something. And you can do this with 3 different payment plans, including a free option. And the free option is like incredibly generous. 25 gigabytes of storage on the free option. Seems like an absolute no-brainer. No more Dropbox, no more WeTransfer, no more Google Drive. One software that can do all of that, and it can do it with lossless audio and a bunch of other producer tools. So thanks to Samply for sponsoring today's video. You can check them out for free using the link down below. And speaking of other members, Bleach technically had a second guitarist credited on the record. His name was Jason Everman. Only thing was, he actually didn't play a single note on Bleach. He provided part of the budget necessary to record at the studio. And in that way, they wanted to make him feel included. So everything in regards to producing this record actually went incredibly fast. For really practical reasons too. They couldn't afford extended studio time.
They did 10 songs in 3 or 4 hours, all live. He did all the vocals afterwards in one take. Probably between 3 p.m. and 5:30 p.m. we mixed all of it down, mixed, if you want to call it mixing. I banged out a quick rough mix for them, and they went off and played a show in Tacoma that night.
Kurt didn't even have a good name for the band at this point. He signed the studio sessions with Kurt Cobain. So the band chose to record on the Otari MX 5050 half-inch tape machine. That was an 8-track tape machine produced originally in 1977. Now, although a 16-track, a Tascam, I think, although that was available and an option, it was more expensive, plus more hours to track overdubs wasn't an option. Okay, but wait, what actually is an 8-track? That's a really good question because, not everyone is familiar in this day and age. It was actually before my day, too, to be clear. I'm not that old. So back in the day, studios obviously recorded to tape rather than digital. And these machines had a limited amount of tracks, usually 8 tracks, 16 tracks, so on and so forth. And if you wanted more instruments than what those 8 tracks could provide, you had to start summing instruments together, which means they're kind of burned permanently together. And that brings us to our next section.
All I had to do was, make sure that the sounds I got were good sounds and then press record and get out of the way. That's what it's like recording a good band.
So the gear that they used on Bleach is remarkably simple. I'm talking like whip out a how to record music for dummies, and this setup is probably the first thing that's going to come up. It's kind of really evidence that shows when you have a really good band involved, just kind of step back and use what works. And really, the whole entire production was recorded on an 8-track, right? But they only used 7 of those 8 tracks to record. That all was going through a Ramza 20-channel board. That all was then going into the 8-track that we mentioned before. And then of those tracks, supposedly the only 2 that went through compression were the bass and the vocals. That was vocals through compression prior to being committed to tape, and then also going through compression again after being committed to tape. And they also used reverb and delay, and I know this is really vague, but I'm going off of the information I could find. But that's it. Remember, this whole process, the whole mixing process, took place in a few hours. So they really didn't want to complicate the process and spend more time than they needed to. Of those 7 tracks, 4 of them were used for drums. So check this out. I was actually struggling to find the specifics about the gear that was used on the record myself, and then I came across this. This is a blog post from 2003 written by Jack himself. Thank you, Jack. This video, I don't think would have been possible without this. I really wish that every producer out there was as willing to share this information as you. So thank you, Jack from 2003. So Chad Channing supposedly used a North Formula drum kit. I've never heard of that kit before, and I only found it on one iffy source. So take it with a bit of grain of salt. But what we do know is that the kick was on channel 1, recorded with a D112. Second slot of the tape machine was taken by an SM57 on the snare, and then tracks 3 and 4 were the stereo overheads. They had a pair of AKG 414s. And then the toms were mic'd with 421s, and those were summed into that stereo overhead track before being committed to tape. 4 tracks for drums. That means we have 4 to go for the rest of the instruments. It's really crazy to me to think the same techniques that I was taught not that long ago were the same techniques being used on my favorite records 30 years ago. Everything's changed, but nothing changed at the same time. It's weird. Hey, really quick, look down below and you'll see that the subscriber count here is pretty small. Super small channel, and we're picking up a lot of steam, but in order to give these videos a fighting chance at all, a like, comment, subscribe, it helps more than I ever thought it would, which is crazy. Anyways, carrying on, thank you. Bassists, I am so sorry. I hear you, I see the comments, and I know that these videos that I produce, there's not much love for bass in them. There's usually not that much information, and I'm sorry. For every piece of documentation that I can find for bass, there's about 10 for guitars, drums, and vocals. But I did find some stuff. For the most part, the bass used on this record was a Fender Jazz bass, specifically during the sessions in December and into early January. Although the first session that happened in January of 1988 with the Melvins drummer, that was done on a Hohner bass. All of it through a Fender Deluxe Twin, recorded using a Sennheiser MD421, and that was going to slot number 5 on the tape recorder. And let's talk a little bit about that Fender Twin for a second. Kurt's tone for Bleach can really be summed up using 3 pieces of gear. The Fender Deluxe Twin Reverb, a Boss DS1 1 and a Univox High Flyer guitar. So the Univox guitar was used almost exclusively during this era. And despite its retro kind of vintage look, the output of those pickups are incredibly high. It is a very heavy guitar, really angry, aggressive tone. Combine that with the Boss DS1, that's Nirvana. All the guitars were tracked on a single Shure SM58, crazy, and that was on slot number 6 with one additional slot number 7 for one additional guitar overdub or one additional vocal overdub. So right up to this point, all of the instruments were recorded live inside of the studio all together. There might have been scratch vocals thrown in, but those were not the ones that ended up on the record. So while there probably was a lot of divisions for the amp and the drum kit to mitigate as much bleed as possible, you can't have that level of bleed on a vocal. So once those tracks were laid down and maybe a scratch vocal was laid down, vocals were done in a proper isolated environment and placed over top all the instruments that were recorded live. All recorded on one SM58.
Just keep practicing and don't give up. Just never give up. Play as often as you can and be really dedicated. It doesn't matter what your product looks like, it's what it sounds like.
So let me open up about something really quick and you'll see where I'm going here. I make these videos with the intention of trying to show you how world famous artists recorded a record when they didn't have any money, when all those artists that we idolize were in the same position that we are right now. And yes, those situations can vary in extremity. Some artists were struggling more than others. Some artists had more support and steam and budget than others. But this record, I think it might be the most emulatable version. If you have a band, you can download Ableton and the free version is going to have 8 tracks. That'll be the track limit. You can commit to one SM57 or 58, that's $100. You can commit to the D112, whatever stereo overheads you can afford, and that Scarlett 4i4. You could even go Behringer and get really cheap. Congrats, you are cooking with gas. You have the Nirvana recipe right there. Because remember, very little was done after the fact. Mixed in a couple of hours using primarily compression on the vocals and the bass, and reverb and delay for taste. We don't really know what they did EQ wise, but I would imagine that's the only part that we have missing. You can do that. So go do that and let me know how it goes. Make sure you subscribe. There's a bunch more videos like this that you can hit right there. See you next time.